And welcome to a special EWTN multimedia bookmark with Robert Orlando, the writer-director of the documentary, The Divine Plan, Ronald Reagan, John Paul II, and the dramatic end of the Cold War, and also Paul Kenger, who worked on a book entitled as well, The Divine Plan, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Of course, check that out, EWTNRC.com. Welcome, Robert. It's the first time you've been here on Bookmark, and welcome to the show. Also, Paul, great to see you again. We recently spoke about your book, The Devil and Karl Marx. So let's start with the idea of the documentary. You're the filmmaker here in the mix. Where did this idea come from?
Well, I had a relationship with Paul Kenger because he worked on my former film on Patton, General Patton. But I also read his prior book, To the Divine Plan, which was The Pope and a President, which was the epic look at the rise and fall of communism through the 20th century. And from reading it and the relationship with Paul, I also watched Paul do a talk at Grove City. I thought there was more that could be explored through the brotherhood of John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, but also what was unexplored was the fact that they both were former actors, and that in seeing through that prism or that lens, you could even get more out of what their character was like and why they were so effective on a world stage.
Okay. Now, Paul, in your case, when you started to work on this, the documentary was in process and you were working along with that. Was it your idea? Whose idea was it to actually decide to also incorporate a book?
Well, so Doug, Rob went out and Rob had the idea for the documentary and he interviewed me. And then after that, I think we interviewed George Weigel after that. And then came a few other people, John O'Sullivan, eventually Bishop Robert Barron, Cardinal Dolan, Ann Applebaum, Douglas Brinkley, H.W. Brandt. I mean, he even got Richard B. Allen, who was the man who sat with Ronald Reagan in Ronald Reagan's living room in June 1979 when Reagan was watching news footage of John Paul II's trip to Poland. Mm-hmm. And so Allen is the guy sitting there with Reagan when Reagan says, wow, that's it. The Pope is the key. The Pope is the key. We've got to find a way to get elected and reach out to this new Polish Pope in the Vatican and make them an ally. Mm-hmm. So Rob did all these interviews, I think 14 altogether. And at one point, I was going through the transcripts. Some of these printed out, Doug, to 20, 30 pages in length. And we contacted the publisher of A Pope and a President, ISI Books, the editor, the great Jet Donahue, and said, look, there's so much original material here from these interviews. There's some fascinating, Bishop Barron's theological insights alone merited some sort of published treatment. And we said, this ought to be we need a companion book to go with Rob Orlando's documentary. Right. And Jet Donahue and ISI Books agreed. So we did, the book was published first in June of 2019, and then the documentary was released, I believe, in November.
Right.
On the screen.
Right, and then, Rob, we had the pleasure of airing it on EWTN. You guys were featured on with Father Mitch as well back in October. Now, let me ask you, there had been various books. There's always been discussions about the connection between Reagan and the Pope. What did you see that you felt you needed to bring anew to this analysis?
So normally a narrative for me starts with being some central core arguments, like can I back up a narrative with these pillar arguments? And after I read Paul's book, funny enough, I read Carl Bernstein's book on the Pope, and I said, well, if you have that spectrum...
Carl, it's worse than Watergate Bernstein.
Yes. So you're making my point. So Paul Kenger, and I even said to Paul, did you read his book? Because they were not close, but they were examining the same material. So there's definitely a wide spectrum that could support most of the evidence for it. But I still think it's it's our D-Day. As I said on D-Day, the Divine Plan is our D-Day because it was without the Great War, but it was the peak of our times of the great conflicts between communism and democracy. That was a carryover from World War II. It was what was never resolved. So I thought it was the greatest story of the 20th century.
Well, one of the connections you make here, connection between two actors. Explain that.
Well, I think people a lot of times tend to mysticize Christianity too much, or they spiritualize it. They forget that there's a real cross. Someone is dying on a cross. But even the Bible and the Gospels are stories. They're narratives. And the reason why they're narratives is because they capture universals. So I also thought, even with the great work Paul has done and so many other scholars, they still did it a historical story. It means that it's more didactic in nature. It builds through history, uses a chronology. I thought going into their values and building a narrative around their close to death assassinations, unifying the next year, and then both agreeing on a mission with the CIA and otherwise to bring down the Soviet Union is a very dramatic story. I mean, that wasn't that wasn't accentuated in the content.
Right, and Paul in the book as well, because they both mirror each other very closely, the idea of, you know, obviously Reagan was a Hollywood actor, some would say a B actor, right? But then you would have, but John Paul too was also an actor. So you have, as Robert brought out in the documentary, and you bring out and working together on the book, this idea that you are dealing with two people who are actors. And I thought it was interesting because then the first thing people say, well, that just shows that they weren't really real. It was really they had an ability to persuade people, but that's not the case, was it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Ronald Reagan, Doug, said people would often say, how can an actor be president? And he would say about halfway through his presidency, looking through it now, I don't know how you couldn't be an actor and be president, right? But Rob's insight here, and really his drive for the documentary, inspiration for the documentary and the book, I really thought this was quite brilliant. I mean, Rob comes from a background in film and acting, and that was his training, his time in college. And Rob said, look, these are two former actors. And of all things, I mean, these two men, their first loves, or among their first loves, right, was acting. Ronald Reagan behind a movie camera, and Karol Wojtyła on the stage and theater. And so here they are in the 1980s, and they ascend to this greatest stage of all, this global stage, this international stage. All the world's a stage, and we are merely players, right? Shakespeare. And for these men, there they were, the whole world watching them. And by the way, too, this is interesting, Doug. These were probably the two most photographed men in history, or in the world, at least at that point in time. They said that about John Paul II. It was probably true of Ronald Reagan by the late 1980s as well. And as Bishop Barron said beautifully a number of times during the interviews for this, even if you look at St. Peter's at the Basilica in Rome, it's almost like staging. People understood the importance of how to set this up, where the Pope stands, where the Pope is situated.
Yeah, exactly.
Cathedrals,
the proscenium effect that you
but
get.
They're
from
literally
that,
three-point lighting because they didn't have interior lights. But I just wanted to add to or pivot off what Paul said. But if people, I think, still don't appreciate that the medium of the time drives a lot of times the success of the public figure. So Reagan's hero was FDR, and he was the fireside chats.
Right.
Right. Then you have theater in the case of John Paul II because their culture is a bit behind, right? And then you have Reagan in the TV era, then John Paul II in the TV era, and then you have reality TV today. Does it bring anybody to mind, reality TV?
Right.
Like Citizen Trump?
Yeah, there you go.
But whoever's successful in the media.
Well, we like to also say that EWTN is totally reality television because it's the truth, and there's nothing more real than the truth.
Right.
So in doing that, and I know your mother was a big fan of EWTN.
Mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law is a big fan.
I mean,
of EWTN.
my whole family's a fan, of course,
so
but my mother-in-law especially.
Okay.
By the way, 95.10.
Right.
Okay.
She
told me to say.
That's the local radio station she hears us on. That's great. Let me ask you too, because obviously a lot of times with these things, you talk about Reagan, he's kind of the past. Even John Paul too, you've got younger people who don't remember when he was the Pope. And at the same time, you did it stylistically in a way that reaches younger people. Was that intentional?
It was. I wanted to, if something is new in content and fresh in content, I want to try and stylize it in a new way so that there's no reference points. I've done this in older documentaries too, where you usually, if you see a lot of religious documentaries and you get the slow motion, the sword drops and the smoke and the dirt, like it references you're back in 1960s or 50s making movies. But I think today the way kids are, first of all, they have no attention span, and beyond that, they do see in graphical reality. So the idea of a hero as someone that's super important or standing out symbolically, I think being in a graphic setting is really important.
And used to getting multiple pieces of information coming at them simultaneously.
Right.
Even if the backdrop is conveying something subliminally, right?
Right. There was three high concepts. If we're looking at this from the creative, artistic side, it was what you just said. So it was like a graphic through line. So there was a heroic aspect. Then there was all the world's a stage. So the idea that actors on an acting in a global stage is almost a double entendre. So that the idea of that. And then the third thing was that we all, in a way, as Christians and human beings trying to find meaning, are acting out our faith. Because faith is, the one piece of information that came in was almost my aphorism for everything was, you learn your divine plan in retrospect, but you can't know in advance. You could have visions, but ultimately you have to live it out. And in living it out, you become an acting person in faith. So I thought there was just so many things rolled out by these two individuals.
I like to think of the expression lamp unto my feet. That's kind of how it ends up working. Let me ask you, Paul, at the very beginning, because a lot of people say, well, we obviously know John Paul II is a very religious man. Reagan, did he even go to church? He didn't seem to be particularly religious. But at the very beginning, you juxtapose, Reagan said, I've always believed that this blessed land was set apart in a special way, talking about the United States. And John Paul II said, the only true freedom, the only freedom that can truly satisfy is the freedom to do what we ought as human beings created by God according to his plan. And people have to have that free will to make that choice.
Yeah, and that picks up with what Rob just mentioned about the acting person. In fact, that was a Karol Wojtyła work. The direct translation from the Polish would be person and act. And his point there was that your actions matter. So this man who became Pope, who was also an actor, said that how you act, your moral choices really define you and who you are. You're not just a simple living, breathing person, right? But you're defined by your actions, your moral actions. And Ronald Reagan said in the Evil Empire speech, of all things, he said, this is about our moral choices, right? You have to stand up and declare that the Soviet Union is an evil empire. We can't just sit back and do nothing, blindly pretend like this doesn't exist. This is a great moral battle and moral battlefield. So the choices we make in that battlefield matters. And he did. He had this providential sense that America was put here by divine providence between these two great oceans for a divine purpose. Ronald Reagan said that in a speech at little tiny William Woods College in Missouri, commencement speech he gave, Doug, in June 1952. So he's a 41-year-old actor, newly married to Nancy Reagan, and he takes a train all the way from California because he didn't fly back then. And he speaks to this group of about 250 women. It's a strictly women's college. And he said, I always believed that this nation was put here for a special purpose, a divine purpose in God's plan. And John Paul II had, of course, too, this providential sense. And no one is surprised to hear that about a pope. But yeah, they're surprised to hear that about Reagan, because a lot of people, you, I, and Rob, we all lived through this. In the 1980s, people said, Reagan, his wife consults astrologers. He doesn't go to church. Well, he did go to church. In fact, he went to church almost every week, his first several weeks as president. He actually joined the National Presbyterian Church. Later, he both the Reagan's pastors, the senior pastor, the associate pastor. He quit going to church when he was almost assassinated on March 30th, 1981. That changed everything. Right. Then, of course, John Paul II was shot 6 weeks after that. And this dovetails right into the thesis of this book. So, these two both believed that as part of this divine plan, that God had spared their lives from those assassination attempts for a special purpose in the Cold War.
Well, one of the great connections you point out in the book, and then it's also in the documentary, and right in the beginning, is this dramatic connection between the two of them having an assassination attempt that weren't far apart, and you kind of don't think of it that way.
Well, 6 weeks, but more interestingly, that they met a year later at the Vatican. And by the way, just as a little backdrop, at that point, John Paul II still thought of Reagan through Western European journalists. So he was still a warmonger. Can we trust him? Is he a man of peace? But when they met...
That sounds familiar, too.
Yeah. But Reagan confided in him that he thought he was spared for a divine reason. And John Paul II agreed with him. So it was almost like a unifying of mission, a galvanizing of their mission. But I just wanted to get back to tie together the idea of freedom with what came before the divine plan story, and now perhaps what's creeping in back today. But that subtle difference between believing human beings as individuals have the freedom to make their own decision and choose the best government and whatever. I mean, that's exactly what collapse was, the alternative view of that, was that the state needed to intervene, even with good intentions. It always starts with good intentions, like, right, hell is paved with good intentions. But even now today, I think it's starting to creep back in because people still don't appreciate the faith aspect with freedom. So I think they both understood that maintaining faith in the world and giving it allows for the freedom of individuals. And that's what, I think that force alone is what brought them down.
Well, you say it's mentioned in the book, it's also mentioned in the documentary that their story is a gripping one. The stakes are high with hundreds of millions of people suffering under murderous Marxist, Leninist regimes. Do you hope a documentary like this, especially reaching, let's say, younger people stylistically, will fill in for the lack of historical understanding that so many people have about the history of socialism per se?
I do, and as part of my personal calling, I would say that I think I wasn't seeing this as my original career, but somewhere along the line I went from just thinking of myself as an entertainer, maybe more insightful, but generally a little more dense, but an entertainer, to seeing how I really needed to start being more of a teacher through the narratives, because some of the historical gaps that were showing up in my studies were just apt. As a matter of fact, I know Paul just did the book, and I'm actually looking to do the follow-up to the Divine Plan on a book about how Marx has creeped back in to our civilization, but it's very subtle, and the common audience won't get it through books. It won't get it through the deep dive of education. So, because they're not going to get an academia, and it's hard to get it on. So they're so stimulated right now, you have to go after them with story.
Right.
But I think a story like the Divine Plan, I joked with Paul recently, and I said the Divine Plan was our journey to heaven. The next one, we go to hell with Marx.
There you go, right. Well, Paul will be a good guide for that from his other book. Paul, there's a quote in here in the section on the acting persons about Dulles. Dulles explained, Cardinal Wojtyła identified, quote unquote, the doctrine of the person as the Achilles heel of the Polish communist regime. And again, to play off what Robert just said, that is key, and we see that today, this idea. What did he mean by the doctrine of the person?
Yeah, he believed that the problem with communism was that it violated the sanctity and dignity of human life. I mean, it was a strictly materialistic, atheistic philosophy. They did not believe the human beings were made in the imago Dei, in the image of God, but they believed, Marx and Engels believed that we evolved. We evolved from apes, that there was no God. Marx said not only that religion is the opiate of masses, but the sigh of the oppressed creature, heart of heartless condition, soul of a soulless world. It is the opiate of the masses. He said communism begins where atheism begins. Lenin said all worship of a divinity is a necrophilia, nothing more abominable than religion. And really, we're having this conversation here on EWTN, the great Catholic network, and there are publications out there, Catholic publications like American Magazine, the Jesuit magazine, which in July 2019 published a piece called Catholic Case for Communism. Catholic Case for Communism, which would have not only shocked the church, but would have shocked Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. Right. So we need to be teaching people this stuff, and I think a good way to also teach about the correct history is to tell this wonderful story of this Pope president who came together, and in this winsome way. I mean, Doug, these two men, they won the battle of the 20th century. Right. They did it peacefully. The Cold War was won without a missile fire. And these two men did this on this international stage in the 80s. It's a great story.
Right, exactly. Well, it's interesting, Paul, that you mentioned that too, because also one of the things recently we've had a lot of peace, but nobody seems to see that as a positive. I'm not sure why. You had a comment.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say again. You talk about a black and white study in contrast. They brought down an potentially epic war in a peaceful way. I remember the most shocking thing for me is John Paul II telling the protesters to go home. It's time to go home now. You've been, like everyone goes to sleep. The peace was part of his the peaceful protest, compared to Marx, who believes the violence is the pure symbol of the revolution that's needed and coming. So for Marx, the very thing that John Paul II and Reagan agreed on is a mask for what's coming, which should be violence.
Right, and you don't build on destruction. That's not the way you go forward for these. What I thought was also interesting in the book and in the documentary, that you talk about their youths And it seems so different, but yet there's an interesting connection. In the book it says the fathers of both Ronald Reagan and Karol Wojtyła prompted their boys to look upward to God. In Reagan's father's case, that was unintentional. His own faults led his son to turn to the Heavenly Father. It's interesting how God works, right?
Yeah, it was in Reagan's, it was a little more difficult. And John Paul II had a very sorrowful life. He lost everyone when he was very young. But Ronald Reagan had an alcoholic dad, and he was a shoe salesman. They traveled and moved, I think, 30 times. So the mom was smart enough. She was a woman of faith, and she pivoted Reagan to her pastor and her pastor's son as role models to play the role of his dad. I think later in life, if Paul can jump in here, but later in life there was more of a connection. His father came back, and there was a redemptive quality to their relationship, but much different in how their fathers led them.
Now, in producing the documentary and going through and having the interviews done, did you sense, like it says here in the Be Not Afraid section, that in the designs of Providence there are no mere coincidences? Did that come home to you?
It did, and even in the making of the film. Things started to fall in place in a way that went beyond just good thinking or creative process, and things started falling into place logistically too. But I just, you brought up his John Paul II's youth. The things that stand out as me as a filmmaker is his first ministry was being a youth minister to young kids and writing books on, can I say sexuality? But he was trying to keep like this organic view. He understood they were young and vibrant, and he would go on canoe trips. And so when I hear that about a future pope, that's coming from an entirely different.
Right.
He's not coming top down. He's growing organically out of his own life experience and suffering to identify with people.
Well, what's great with, I think, his example, Paul, would be the fact that one can reach out to young people and to people, let's say, who feel alienated without playing fast and loose with the truth. In fact, one of the quotes here, I thought was interesting, that you had an interview with Bishop Barron who said, that this is the Pope. He understood the enemy from the inside. When he went into the conclave in '78 that elected him Pope, they were allowed to bring in some reading material. What did he bring? Not the Bible, not Thomas Aquinas. He brought, they say, a Marxist philosophical journal. What did you think when you found that out?
Right. Yeah, no, he was very well read. I mean, know thy enemy, right? And Ronald Reagan used to joke that a communist is somebody who reads Marx, an anti-communist is somebody who understands Marx. Right. And if I could pick up on that point from their youth, I think this is a fascinating parallel here, Doug. So Ronald Reagan and Karol Wojtyła both came from a home with a mom and a dad and one brother. So these were very small families. And in Ronald Reagan's case, one of the most formative moments in his life, he's walking home, 11 years old, from the YMCA. It's February 1922. And he sees his father laid out, spread eagle, on the front porch in the snow. And he's drunk. His father was drunk. In fact, Ronald Reagan said his arms were stretched out, crucified, as if he were crucified. And Reagan picked him up, lifted him up the stairs, brought him in the house. And it was from there that Ronald Reagan's mom taught him that, look, the person you need to really rely on. And the mother was very kind. She said, father has a sickness. You need to love him. But she really taught him to rely on his heavenly Father. Right. And it's interesting that when Karol Wojtyła, he lost his mother at a very young age. In fact, about the same age when Ronald Reagan almost lost his mother from the influenza epidemic, 1819, 1920. And Karol Wojtyła's father took him to see the Madonna in Poland, Częstochowa. Said, this is now your mother. This is now your mother. So he was taught to look to his spiritual mother, which would be Mary. And tragically, in Karol Wojtyła's case, he lost everybody in his family by the 40s. And he said to people, I'm all alone now. I'm all alone. My mother is gone. My father is gone. My brother is gone. I'm all alone. So he really, he had even more to overcome in his personal life than Ronald Reagan.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting if you think of it that way. Because of, and what he went through, obviously, under the Nazi regime and then under the communist regime as well. So you also have in there, obviously, the two assassinations. Obviously, Hinckley was somebody who was a little off-centered there, decided he wanted to shoot, Ronald Reagan to impress an actress. But when we're talking about this situation here with the assassination attempt on the Pope, now, has it ever been proven who was actually behind it? Do you have a sense in making the film? What do you say in the film?
They do, and as a matter of fact, Ali Agca, Agca, it's a funny pronunciation, but he was there, and he actually was supposed to get on a truck, and there was another assassin after he killed the Pope that was going to kill him, but he fortunately got tackled by a nun on the way to the truck and saved his life ultimately. But he, there's mixed reviews on how ultimately he came to see the Pope. I believe the first time he saw the Pope, he said, if I saw you again, I would shoot you again. He had no redemptive.
Right.
But I thought later in life, he thought of him as a good man and had regrets for what he had tried to do. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, nobody could believe that the Bulgarians did that on their own, you know. That's like they used to say in New York, you know, nobody does a hit on a capo unless the Godfather says it's okay. And I think that might have been in the Kremlin at the time. We are just out of time. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for the wonderful book. Thank you, Paul, for all your efforts. Obviously, Robert Orlando and his documentary, The Divine Plan, and also the book, The Divine Plan, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Check them out. Worth your time. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks for spending time with us here on Bookmark. We'll see you next time.